Okay, so this is lecture 5 of Josephus Part 2, Historian and Bible Commentator by Rabbi Lawrence Troster, and it is March 11th. Okay, so we are continuing with the siege of Jerusalem by Titus, and we were really in year 70 now, and Titus has moved and to surround Jerusalem. There's been a series of attacks. The defenders of the city, looking at the map of the stationing, there are several legions, one of which is up on the Mount of Olives, and the others are in on the west part of the city. And the legion that's on the Mount of Olives is the Legio 10th Fretensis, is officially the name of the legion. We will learn more about them as they are important for this history. And what the Romans try and do is, when they finally get down to the siege, is to begin to attack the city at its weakest point, which is the northwestern part, where it's flattest and where the third wall was, which was probably not complete. They also have surrounded the city, essentially, to cut it off, to prevent any further people coming into the city, to prevent people going out of the city, in order to basically starve them out. The defenders had been attacking each other right up until the time that Titus arrives, including one faction burned the grain stores of the city, which is going to have horrendous implications a little later on. So if you take a look on page 5 of the material I gave you last time, the chronology of the siege, down at the bottom, it says that Titus, Josephus, and Nicanor, who's one of his generals and an old friend, do a reconnaissance around the city, and Nicanor is hit by an arrow in the shoulder, and they decide to attack the city from the northwest corner in order to capture the city, the upper city, which is all this, because again, there's the city's divided into sort of three large parts. There's the upper city, there's the Temple Mount, and there's the lower city. The lower city is what we call today the city of David, the village of Silwan. The upper city is the western what is now Mount Zion, the Jewish quarter, up into the Christian and Muslim quarter today. That whole area there, because of the topography, it's higher up. Okay, so that's the upper city. And so the object is to try and break into the upper city. And also a key point that they're trying to get is the Antonia fortress, which is on the northwest corner of the temple. That's the area where the valley, there's a very steep valley, which you only see part of today because of the debris of the millennia, where the Western Wall Plaza is. The original street level is some, at least 30 feet below that. So that's was originally a very steep valley. You still see it somewhat if you're going from Jaffa Gate down to the Western Wall. You do go down, but it was a lot more back then. So that valley surrounds most of the western part of the temple, and kind of comes around the south part down towards the city of David. On the east side of the Temple Mount, there's still a very steep Kidron Valley, which you see today, that separates the temple, the Har Zion, the original Har Zion, which is the Temple Mount, from the Mount of Olives and Mount Scopus. So the area, the northwest, the valley that that is on the western side kind of peters out. It kind of rises up, so it's relatively flat there. So the northwest corner is the weakest part of the Temple Mount, and that's where the Antonia Fortress was. There's still actually pieces of the Antonia Fortress that are visible today. If you take an archaeological tour of the old city, it's incorporated into later buildings. And the Antonia was also where the Roman garrison was originally, to control the Temple Mount, because, and when the procurator was in Jerusalem, that's where the procurator probably stayed, and it was an easy access to the Temple Mount to quell any problems. And during the time the Romans were in occupation, it had to be done numerous times. Yeah.
Is that what's called the Tower of David?
No, not called the Tower of David. The Tower of David is where the Jaffa Gate is today. Okay. Which is where there was an extensive palace, a Herodian palace, right at that point, which also becomes a strong point. In other words, there are various palaces, large public buildings. The Jaffa Gate is here. Okay, that's where it says it says a Herodian palace, and there's a Hasmonean palace here, and then there's the tomb of John Hyrcanus is here, the Hasmonean king. Okay, so these large public buildings are in fact strongholds and fortresses, and the Herodian palace is a fortress because it controlled the western entrance to the city. So the Romans wanted to go in through that because it's a lot easier to do that. And as you see, because there are several walls, as the city expanded, it creates, it divides the city up into defensible areas. So you break into one, and then you've got another wall that you have to then face before you get further into the city. So they decide to assault in the northwest corner, and they start building earthworks. And if you go on page 6 of the chronology, they start shooting artillery at each other, meaning large stones. The Judeans have, of course, had captured a number of Roman artillery pieces when they had defeated them earlier. And the 10th Legion apparently has catapults able to send a 75-pound stone approximately 370 meters, which is pretty far, and can also, when they come down, gravity being what it is, can actually cause a huge amount of damage to the walls. So then what happens after that, they bring up battering rams. And the battering rams, of course, cause counterattacks. And as a result, a Roman siege tower collapses. And after 15 days of battering, the third wall breaks. And the Romans raze a large part of it, as well as the north part of the city. And so then Titus moves within that area of the city where which the third wall had protected, which is this part here, you see. Throughout this, there are occasional attempts at negotiation, but they don't really come to anything. And then they, of course, begin to attack the second wall. And the second wall is breached only 5 days later in May. I mean, what you're seeing here is a relentless Roman siege where the outcome to us is, pretty obvious as to what's going to happen. And by June 4th, they master the second wall and raise that part of it. And then there is a pause where the soldiers get paid. What happens is that he then has them build various embankments. In other words, as they're moving forward, they have to keep moving forward their own siege works, which are these embankments and walls that are meant to not only keep the besiegers at bay, but to protect the soldiers, the besiegers, from the defenders. So if they make a sortie, they will be able to do it. Also, this is a point where the Titus tries to get them to surrender. Again, they absolutely refuse. Again, this is all Josephus's account. And then what happens is that you have Josephus's famous appeal to the rebels to surrender, which we had looked at in detail when we looked at his history. Namely, if you remember, he went up to the walls and he tried to tell them in this long speech that he records. Again, it's recorded years later, but let's assume that most of it is accurate. And he tries to he speaks to them in Aramaic and tries to get them to surrender. They absolutely refuse, and they try to kill him by shooting arrows and lances and so on and so forth at him. What happens is that there all throughout the siege there are people who try to leave the city and desert to the Romans, and the Romans aren't necessarily going to accept those refugees, and if they are rebels, they will be killed. And if you turn on page 7. You will see that as they are constructing the embankments, they capture whoever's leaving. They torture them, kill them, crucify them as a way of demoralizing the defenders and trying to get them to stop the siege. But also, crucifixion is what the Romans did for rebels. Yeah.
That sounds. If your enemy is out there, and if you surrender, they're going to torture you and crucify you. I mean, you don't have much of an incentive to surrender.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, but that was what they did to rebels. That was what they did. And so you're right, the Judeans then, it has the reverse effect, according to Josephus. They swear they're going to fight to death. According to Josephus, Titus continues to exhort the rebels to surrender peacefully and save the city and the temple. This again, if you remember from last time, Josephus constantly tries to portray Titus as being a noble and being, in favor of this, and we're going to actually look at a different account of this. What happens in June, in the middle of June, is the rebels have been beginning to do what's called countermining, where they dig under these earthware fortifications. They have to shore up the tunnels with wood, and then they set fire to the tunnels so that they collapse all at once, and thereby bringing down the earthworks up above. This is an ancient siege technique that was used in the First World War, only with explosives. And it was done in the Civil War as well with explosives, where you try and undermine your enemy's defensive lines, fill them up with gunpowder, and then blow them to smithereens. The point is, this actually works, and Titus decides at this point he's going to starve the city by completely cutting it off. What's interesting is that there's one incident where Josephus is knocked unconscious by a missile. Why don't we take a look at that? That's actually quite probably worth taking a look at. So it's Book 5 of the Wars, and it's line 541.
Page 869.
869, chapter 13.
869.
Book 5, chapter 13.
It's Book 5, chapter 13, line 541. It's chapter 513, section 3. If you've got this copy, it's 869 down on the bottom left corner. In the meantime. Everybody got that? Book 5, chapter 13, section 3, line 541. Suzanne, you want to begin reading that?
In the meantime, Josephus, as he was going round the city, had his head wounded by a stone that was thrown at him, upon which he fell down as giddy. Upon which fall of his, the Jews made a sally, and he had been hurried away into the city, if Caesar had not sent men to protect him immediately. And as these men were fighting, Josephus was taken up, though he heard little of what was done. So the seditious supposed they had now slain that man, whom they were the most desirous of killing, and made thereupon a great noise in way of rejoicing. This accident was told in the city, and the multitude that remained became very disconsolate at the news.
Yeah, this translation says this rumor was told in the city.
Right, makes more sense.
Mm-hmm.
As being persuaded that he was really dead, on whose account alone they could venture to desert to the Romans.
In other words, because Josephus with the Romans, they felt if they deserted, maybe he would help save their lives.
Right.
Go on.
But when Josephus' mother heard in prison that her son was dead, she said to those that watched about her that she had always been of opinion, since the siege of Jotapata, that he would be slain, and she would never enjoy him alive any more. She also made great lamentation privately to the maidservants that were about her, and said that this was all the advantage she had of bringing so extraordinary a person as this son into the world, that she should not be able even to bury that son of hers, by whom she expected to have been buried herself.
Now, what happened is the rebels at one point imprisoned all of Josephus' relatives, including his mother. Okay, so she's in prison, and she hears this rumor that he's dead. Okay, and undoubtedly, Josephus heard this from his family afterwards. What she had said. Go on.
However, this false report did not put his mother to pain, nor afford merriment to the robbers long. For Josephus soon recovered of his wound, and came out and cried out loud that it would not be long ere they should be punished for this wound they had given him. He also made a fresh exhortation to the people to come out upon the security that would be given them. This sight of Josephus encouraged the people greatly, and brought a great consternation upon the seditious.
Now, the question is, did this really happen? I mean, Josephus is putting himself in the best possible light here, right? That he gets this personal wound, and, there's this horrible thing. His mother is really, it's very melodramatic. And it's, again, trying to put him in the sort of, in the role of a hero rather than a traitor. How much of this is true or not, we don't know. I mean, again, Josephus is not writing what we would call objective history in our sense of the word, and he is, he's writing at a time when he wants to justify what he did. So we just don't know. We have no idea. Maybe he probably did get wounded, but the point is, the fact that there were all these people in the city who were, supporters of his, who knows? All right, so what happens is that rather grisly little incident, some of the troops discover that the deserters have swallowed gold coins. So, in effect, the rumor goes around that they're all swallowed gold coins. So, apparently some Syrian and Arab auxiliaries cut open anyone who escapes the city to see if they've got gold in their stomachs. Anyway, according, if you go to line 567, which is on page 871, this is book 5, chapter 13, section 7. I think that one of the this is where he lists some of the casualties at the time. Suzanne, you want to continue that? And indeed,
why do I relate these particular calamities? Well, Menaeus, the son of Lazarus, came running to Titus at this very time, and told him that there had been carried out through the gate, which was entrusted to his care, no fewer than 115,880 dead bodies in the interval between the 14th day of the month Xanthicus,
which is Nisan in April, we would say,
when the Romans pitched their camp by the city, and the first day of the month Panemus, or Tammuz.
That's July 20th.
This was itself a prodigious multitude, and though this man was not himself set as a governor at that gate, yet was he appointed to pay the public stipend for carrying these bodies out, and so was obliged of necessity to number them, while the rest were buried by their relations, though all their burial was but this, to bring them away and cast them out of the city. After this man there ran away to Titus many of the eminent citizens, and told him the entire number of the poor that were dead, and that no fewer than 600,000 were thrown out at the gates, though still the number of the rest could not be discovered. And they told him farther, that when they were no longer able to carry out the dead bodies of the poor, They laid their corpses on heaps in very large houses and shut them up therein. As also that a mendimnus of wheat was sold for a talent, and that when, a while afterward, it was not possible to gather herbs, by reason the city was all walled about, some persons were driven to that terrible distress as to search the common sewers and old dunghills of cattle, and to eat the dung which they got there. And what they of old could not endure so much as to see, they now used for food. When the Romans barely heard all this, they commiserated their case, while the seditious, who saw it also, did not repent, but suffered the same distress to come upon themselves, for they were blinded by that fate, which was already coming upon the city and upon themselves also.
So notice again how he is trying to make the Romans look compassionate. All right. In other words, it's interesting. He wants, and I've mentioned this before, there are times when he wants the Jews to appear heroic, like when they attacked the 10th Legion on the Mount of Olives. He hates the leaders of the rebels. He hates the rebels in general. So on the one hand, he wants to, for non-Jewish audiences, he wants to see this as a great, heroic, tragic struggle, like the wars between the Spartans and the Athenians. On the other hand, he hates what happened because of the tragedy involved. He's against it. And he, of course, writing this under the patronage of the Flavians, he wants to not make the Romans look too bad. But these are all very competing ideas, and I think it's hard for him to juggle all of these particular balls, if you know what I mean. So it ends up sometimes with some strange sort of juxtapositions and conflicts in the narrative.
I think these numbers are greatly inflated. Could there have been that many people?
Yeah, that's part of the problem. It's hard to say.
115,000?
Yeah, I mean, he's talking already 750,000 people here.
Yeah.
And that is, to us, it just seems unbelievable.
I just wonder, how could they bring out all those dead bodies and yet not be captured by the Romans?
Well, evidently there must have been some arrangement, but for some of the bodies to come out and be buried, because of course the Jewish tradition, well, anybody of those days had a great abhorrence of not having one's body properly buried. In the Jewish tradition is they should be buried very quickly, but this was unable to them. And you notice he says they were the poor who couldn't pay to get the bodies taken out of the city because there was a fee involved, just piled them up inside empty houses and shut up the houses like they were tombs. But don't forget, there was all kinds of restrictions. They didn't allow burials inside Jerusalem because of the temple. So this is like completely changing everything that's going on. Yeah.
In the First World War, in the trench warfare, which we think of as absolutely no quarter given or asked, they would stop the fighting so people could go out to bring in the dead bodies.
Yeah.
There were always these mini armistices.
Exactly.
And obviously this kind of thing was going on there.
Yeah.
And the other thing that comes to my mind about these numbers is if it wasn't for photography, none of us would believe 6 million in the Shoah. You would say it's impossible.
Well, exactly. These numbers are very difficult to grasp, extremely difficult to grasp. So, yeah.
Today, can you bury in Jerusalem?
No, there are no cemeteries within the old city, there are cemeteries that are officially within the boundaries of modern Jerusalem, but none of them. Well, the closest one you get to the old city is the Mount of Olives, right, which was a traditional burial ground for centuries and centuries. We know that in the First Temple period that there were tombs within the city. In the lower city, in the Ir David, you can see them. The remains of them are there, and also in the Kidron Valley, there are ruins of Second Temple tombs, rather large and elaborate ones. So, but they didn't want to have anything come close to the Temple Mount, because the dead body is the highest form of impurity. So there you go. But yeah, there are cemeteries within the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem today. Herzl, there's several of them. Okay, so unfortunately, this is where I'm going to have to read you. Anyway, what happens at the beginning of Book 6, though, which is sort of the last entrance on the chronology that I did give you, is that they start making new earthworks around the Antonio, and it takes them like 3 weeks. In notice it says, these are heavily guarded as all timber had been used within 10 miles of the city. And this is one of the horrible things that happened, is that the forests around Jerusalem were cut down to build the various works for the siege. And the cutting down of the forests of Jerusalem was a huge amount of environmental degradation in the Jerusalem area, which the forests were only replanted by the Zionists in the beginning of the 20th century. The forests you see around Jerusalem today are the ones that, although even there, some of them have been cut down by modern development, but the fact is, for 2,000 years, practically, there were no forests around Jerusalem because of the Roman siege. Because when you take the trees out, it ruins the soil, gets washed away, and so environmental degradation caused by warfare is one of the worst things that humans do, and can last for, well, almost 2,000 years. Okay.
The problem in Haiti.
Yeah.
Because the French deforested the place.
Right, and it's a problem, by the way, from the first Iraq War. Large parts, because the United States used depleted uranium weapons, which is highly poisonous. It contaminated all kinds of soil and caused all kinds of birth defects and health impacts, and probably is the origin of the Gulf War syndrome that soldiers came back with, because they breathed in the dust from these explosions and got this depleted uranium in them. Okay, so we're now into Book 6, and what he does at the beginning is talk about they bring siege engines against the Antonia fortress, and they try to undermine the foundations, and a portion of it does collapse. But the besiegers are not stupid. Once they knock down the wall of the Antonia, they find the defenders have built another wall behind it, which again is very typical of siege warfare, even up to the 20th century. And what happens is the troops get quite dispirited, and Titus has to give a little speech this is in Book 6, Chapter 1, Section 5, lines 33 to 53. So again, Josephus records this speech of Titus, sort of exhorting his troops that God is on their side, and also, this is quite interesting, it's more glorious to die in battle than of disease, because fallen warriors immediately. This is the latter part, close to, this is in the early 50s, lines 50s. Up above 49 or so. Basically, he's saying that it's better to die in battle, because warriors who are killed in battle will be take their place among the stars rather than the underworld.
Is that what they believe?
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Okay, so the afterlife is that if you do this, then you will, actually it's in line, I'm going to read it, it's in line 46, starting in line 46. He says, or 47, for what man of virtue is there that does not know that those souls which are severed from their fleshly bodies in battles by the sword are received by the ether, that purest of elements, meaning the above the air, and joined to that company which are placed among the stars, that they become good. And here the translation says demons. That's a wrong translation. It's probably daimons, which means spirits, right? Not demons. And propitious heroes, and show themselves as such to their prosperity afterwards.
Posterity.
Who's speaking?
This is Titus
Titus.
exhorting his, let me find the actual, better translation here. He says, souls released from the flesh are welcomed by the purest of elements and are placed among the stars. That, and here they translate it as good genies, genii, and I think you have to say good spirits, kind of, you become a kind of we would call them semi-angelic beings. So that is an interesting point, that they believe that warriors had a special place up above as opposed to going to Hades, right? Anyway, apparently this inspires a few people, and they try and keep attacking. And finally, what's an important point here, if you go to line 93, which is on page 877. This is Book 6, Chapter 2. And Irma, do you want to start reading that? This is a very important point in what's going in the siege.
And now Titus gave orders to his soldiers that were with him to dig up the foundations of the tower of Antonia and make him a ready passage for his army to come up, while he himself had Josephus brought to him, for he had been informed that on that very day, which was the 17th day of Panemus Tammuz, the sacrifice called the daily sacrifice had failed, and had not been offered to God for want of men to offer it, and that the people were grievously troubled at it, and commanded him to say the same things to John that he had said before, that if he had any malicious inclination for fighting, he might come out with as many of his men as he pleased, in order to fight, without the danger of destroying either his city or temple.
Okay, stop there. So what happens here? Here's, by the way, again, this is a model of the temple, and there's the Antonia. So this is the northwest corner of the temple. This is where the action took place.
The Antonia is a wall?
Is a fortress.
Fortress.
The fortress on the northwest corner of the temple. Okay? So, what happens? What happens is that Josephus recounts that the daily sacrifice, the Tamid, it's called, stops on the 17th of Tammuz. This was every single day there was a sacrifice for the day. That is, no matter what day it was. Then, like on Shabbat, there was an extra sacrifice, the Musaf, and there were special sacrifices for the various holidays. Then there were the sacrifices that people brought for their own versions, for sin offerings, for Thanksgiving offerings. But every single day in the morning, and there was a grain offering in the afternoon, the mincha.
Even though they were starving.
What?
Even though they were starving.
Every single day up until the 17th of Tammuz. Now, this was considered to be, by the way, also during the time before the rebellion, there was a daily sacrifice for the emperor. As a way of honoring the emperor instead of having to do a sacrifice to the emperor. Okay? So, and in fact, if you remember, the sort of official beginning of the rebellion was when they stopped sacrificing in honor of the emperor. But the Tamid was holy. It's in the Torah. I mean, it's like, it's one of the most important things that's done as a daily ritual in the temple. And the fact they were managed throughout everything to continue to do this sacrifice, no matter all the factional fighting and everything that was going on, the Tamid continued to be done. And people still tried to go to the temple to be part of the various worship. And finally, on the 17th of Tammuz, which was July 22nd in the year 70, the Tamid stopped. And this was seen by the population as a great calamity. In fact,
stopped just because things were so bad?
Yeah, and as he says, there's no one around to do it, to offer it anymore. There were no priests around that were able to do it. The situation was so dire that there wasn't a single priest that could do it. And I guess I can't urge on you more how people saw this. This was considered a spiritual catastrophe. Okay?
Yeah.
And So it's a really terrible thing that happened.
Well, you lose God on your side.
Yeah, exactly. And notice also in the passage that Irma read that Titus is still, according to Josephus, still saying, if you stop now, we'll save the danger of destroying the city or the temple, that he desired he would not defile the temple, nor thereby offend against God. And he offered them to allow them continue to do sacrifices and so on and so forth. So again, how is Titus being portrayed? He's being portrayed as magnanimous, as noble, as respectful of the Jews' religious practice, and I don't know. You know what? You'll see. I don't believe this.
Yeah.
I honestly don't. This is Josephus. I mean, obviously Titus doesn't want to destroy the city. Okay, he doesn't really want to do it. But whether he cared about the temple or not, as you will see, is highly problematic. Okay, now Josephus tries to deliver another message within the hearing of the populace, and what happens is that there's this all fails, and one of the things that happens after this negotiation is that large numbers of upper class citizens, including priests, desert to the Romans. Again, I imagine there's a lot of people who would like to get out of the city who haven't been able to at certain points, who are trying to hang on, whatever. And what happens is there's a major battle because the Romans had broken through the Antonia. A big battle takes place on that in that part of the attack here for the temple. Right? So the temple itself is now a focus. The temple grounds, the platform that we still see today, the temple, what we call the Temple Mount, is now the focus of the fighting. That's how close things have gotten, and how bad things have become.
Did they say what happened? Did he say what happened to those, including the priests who went over to the Romans?
I don't. Well, take a look. Look, if you take a look at where we were reading, on the next page, hang on, this is a long. If you go to number 130. It doesn't appear that, it doesn't appear to say what happened. Okay. Now, in addition to this, there are earthworks are built around the first wall, which it shows you that it's getting quite close to them. The northwest corner of the temple, the northern hall between the two gates, and what happens is that the rebels again attack the 10th Legion on the Mount of Olives, which in the early part of the siege there had been this major attack, almost broke the Legion. Titus supposedly came and personally rallied the 10th Legion, and but the rebels are repulsed. On August the 10th, the rebels set fire to the northwest portico that is connected to the Antonia to separate the temple from the occupied fortress, and that would be this area here. You see. I mean, at this point, there's no way the rebels could have believed that they were going to win, and so the Romans set fire to it, and there's a lot of fighting going around the west porticos, and with a lot of victims on either side. And if you go to line 193, this describes what's going on in terms of the because now
Bottom of 883.
Yeah, the bottom of 883. Now it's talking about the famine, because remember, even before the siege began, because of the factional fighting, the grain stocks had been burned. So we're now on Book 6, Chapter 3, Section 3, line 193, which is at the bottom of page 883. Cal, do you want to pick it up there now, of those that perished?
Now, of those that perished by famine in the city, the number was prodigious, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of any kind of food did anywhere appear, a war was commenced presently, and the dearest friends fell fighting one with another about it, snatching from each other the most miserable supports of life. Nor were men believed that those who were dying had no food, but the robbers would search them when they were expiring, lest any one should have concealed food in their bosoms, and counterfeited dying. Nay, those robbers gaped for want, and ran about stumbling and staggering along like mad dogs, and reeling against the doors of the houses like drunken men. They would also, in the great distress they were in, rush into the very same houses 2 or 3 times in one and the same day. Moreover, their hunger was so intolerable that it obliged them to chew everything, while they gathered such things as the most sordid animals would not touch, and endured to eat them. Nor did they at length abstain from girdles and shoes. The very leather which belonged to their shields they pulled off and gnawed.
So one of the things is that Josephus is a really good writer. Okay, he's really able to evoke what's going on in very vivid detail. I think that's one of the things that we have to understand, that he's an incredibly skillful author. Now, how much did his Greek secretaries touch up for, to make it better in Greek? We don't know, obviously, because he didn't speak Greek, and how did it translate well from Aramaic? But the point is, the final product is incredibly artistic narrative and deeply moving. Read on.
The very wisps of old hay became food to some, and some gathered up fibers and sold a very small weight of them for 4 Attic drachmae. But why do I describe the shameless impudence that the famine brought on men in their eating inanimate things, while I am going to relate a matter of fact, the like to which no history relates, either among the Greeks or barbarians? It is horrible to speak of it, and incredible when heard. I had indeed willingly omitted this calamity of ours, that I might not seem to deliver what is so portentous to posterity. But that I have innumerable witnesses to it in my old age, and besides my country would have had little reason to thank me for suppressing the miseries that she underwent at this time.
So he's trying to justify why he's
Is
being
that
so...
what we've just read, or what we're about to read?
Well, what we just read, but he's going to continue to do this. In other words, he's trying to say, I'm not just doing this to, because I'm trying to make a great narrative here. And it's not just me saying this. I have had numerous witnesses among my contemporaries, because after all, he wasn't inside the city, so he had to hear it from survivors. So he's justifying his incredibly elaborate discussion of the famine, and he's claiming that there has never been such a narrative ever written before amongst the Greeks or the non-Greek speaking populations. That's what you called anyone who didn't speak Greek were barbarians, right? That wasn't a term for what we normally call barbarians. The Greeks divided the world into those who spoke Greek and those who didn't. And the ones who didn't, they called barbarians, because non-Greek sounded like bar to them. Okay? Now, the Jews divided the world into Jews, Greeks, and barbarians, because they didn't want to be classified as, Jews and Gentiles are divided into Greeks and barbarians, okay? Anyway, so now he's going to tell a story of a particular person, okay, in the siege. Read on, Cal.
There was a certain woman that dwelt beyond Jordan. Her name was Mary. Her father was Eleazar of the village Bethezub, which signifies the house of hyssop. She was eminent for her family and her wealth, and had fled away to Jerusalem with the rest of the multitude, and was with them besieged therein at this time. The other effects of this woman had been already seized upon, such I mean as she had brought with her out of Perea, and removed to the city. What she had treasured up besides, as also what food she had contrived to save, had been also carried off by the rapacious guards, who came every day running into her house for that purpose.
So here's this poor woman who's come from Transjordan, by the way. That's where the town she comes from. And she brought whatever she could, including food, and she keeps getting stolen from her by the guards. Go on. But this poor woman...
This put the poor woman into a very great passion, and by the frequent reproaches and imprecations she cast at these rapacious villains, she had provoked them to anger against her.
And according to this translation, it says this poor woman constantly abused and cursed these extortioners. Go on.
And what was their response in their translation?
And so incensed them against her. Go on.
But none of them, either out of the indignation she had raised against herself or out of commiseration for her case, would take away her life.
According to this, it says, when no one either out of exasperation or pity put her to death, weary of finding her, go on.
This is written in Aramaic.
Originally written in Aramaic.
And so it seems to be translated in almost Elizabethan language.
Well, that's your translation.
So how is that? Is that?
That's an old translation. That's a very old
Translation.
translation. I'm reading from a more recent one here.
Yeah.
Okay. Go on.
And if she found any food, she perceived her labors were for others and not for herself, and it was now become impossible for her anyway to find any more food, while the famine pierced through her very bowels and marrow, when also her passion was fired to a degree beyond the famine itself. Nor did she consult with anything but with her passion and the necessity she was in. She then attempted a most unnatural thing, and snatching up her son, who was a child sucking at her breast, she said, O thou miserable infant, for whom shall I preserve thee in this war, this famine, and this sedition? As to the war with the Romans, if they preserve our lives, we must be slaves. This famine will also destroy us, even before that slavery comes upon us. Yet are these seditious rogues more terrible than both the other. Come on, be thou my food, and be thou a fury to these seditious varlets, and a byword to the world, which is all that is now wanting to complete the calamities of us Jews. As soon as she had said this, she slew her son, and then roasted him, and ate the one half of him, and kept the other half by her concealed. Upon this the seditious came in presently, and smelling the horrid scent of this food, they threatened her that they would cut her throat immediately if she did not show them what food she had gotten ready. She replied that she had saved a very fine portion of it for them, and withal uncovered what was left of her son. Hereupon they were seized with a horror and amazement of mind, and stood astonished at the sight, when she said to them, This is mine own son, and what hath been done was mine own doing. Come, eat of this food, for I have eaten of it myself. Do not you pretend to be either more tender than a woman, or more compassionate than a mother, but if you be so scrupulous, and do abominate this my sacrifice, as I have eaten the one half, lest the rest be reserved for me also. After which these men went out trembling, being never so much affrighted at anything as they were at this. And with some difficulty they left the rest of the meat to the mother. Upon which the whole city was full of this horrid action immediately, and while everybody laid this miserable case before their own eyes, they trembled, as if this unheard of action had been by themselves. So those that were thus distressed by the famine were very desirous to die, and those already dead were esteemed happy, because they had not lived long enough either to hear or to see such miseries.
So the question is, did this really happen? Okay, it's quite possible, because people in these situations did resort to cannibalism, but there's something a little suspicious about this, in my mind, and I'll tell you why. In the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 28, it's part of Parshat Ki Tavo, are what's called the blessings and the curses, the tochechot, and it lists all of the horrible things that will happen to you, this is Moses talking, if you break the covenant with God. Now, in chapter 28, verse 49, it begins to talk about how God will bring a foreign nation upon you and besiege you and exile you. Eventually, it says, and exile you. Now, this account has to be written, I don't know, maybe it probably dates from the time of after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the first destruction, right? Because it describes what would be like in a siege. And what does it say? It says, starting in the middle of verse 52.
Is Deuteronomy what?
Chapter 28, middle of verse 52. And when you are shut up in all your towns throughout your land that the Lord your God has assigned to you, you shall eat your own issue, the flesh of your sons and daughters that the Lord your God has assigned you, because of the desperate straits to which your enemy shall reduce you. He who is most tender and fastidious among you shall be too mean to his brother and the wife of his bosom and the children he has spared, to share with them any of the flesh of the children that he eats, because he has nothing else left as a result of the desperate straits to which your enemy shall reduce you in all your towns. And here's verse 56. And she who is most tender and dainty among you, so tender and dainty that you would never venture to set a foot on the ground, shall begrudge the husband of her bosom, her son and her daughter, the afterbirth that issues from between her legs, and the babies she bears. She shall eat them secretly because of utter want in the desperate straits to which your enemy shall reduce you in your towns. So is this real that Josephus describes? Or is he creating this scene based on Deuteronomy?
Or is Deuteronomy merely based on what happens in sieges, and this is repeated? Rabbi,
Yeah, absolutely.
You are by nature a spiritual man, and it offends you that this could happen?
No, I think it could happen.
In the siege of Leningrad, exactly this happened.
I'm saying it's quite possible that this story is 100% true. All I'm saying is you have a literary parallel in the Torah itself for a woman killing her own baby and eating it.
And I'd have little doubt, Rabbi, if we go back before that to Antiquity and with the Egyptians, you will find horrible stories.
Absolutely,
like this.
Absolutely. But all I'm saying is that is Josephus's account colored by the Deuteronomic? It fits with the ideology, right? That having defied God,
Right.
this is the straits to which you are reduced. That would fit with Josephus's theology.
Oh, yes,
I am
he's
not,
saying that.
Yeah.
you know, and it is. Robert could be 100% right. He's just telling a story, maybe with a little bit of elaboration because he wasn't there. He heard it afterwards. This horrible thing that happened. But the fact is that I can't help when I read this to be reminded of the passage in Deuteronomy and wonder whether it influences the telling of this tale, right? Because Josephus was not an eyewitness to this tale. Yes.
How can the children of God be driven to cannibalism?
If you are starving to death, adults will eat their children
Do you mean how could God allow that?
because they broke the covenant. According to Deuteronomy, this is what will happen to you. And Josephus, working within that same religious tradition, sees the rebels as having broken the covenant with God, gone against the will of God. And as a result, the populace is suffering the consequences. Remember, we looked at his theology. The Romans are ruling because God wants you to rule. If you rebel against the Romans, you're rebelling against God. And look at the consequences of what happens. Sam, you had a question.
That was it. I was going to ask you what the rationale was. So this is seen, according to the Romans, as rebelling
No,
against...
Josephus saw it this way.
Yeah.
In other words, in one of the in part one of the series, when we looked at the theology of Josephus, his understanding of things, he was working within a very traditional theology dating back to the time of the destruction of the first temple. That if there's an empire that's ruling you, then it's God's will that you should be ruled by that empire. and you don't rebel. Okay, so what happens is now is this is a really interesting thing. August 28th. This is in line 229, and this is where I want to spend some time. This is Book 6, Chapter 4, a paragraph, Section 2, line 229. And we are, let's skip a little further down. I don't want to start there. Okay. All right, let's start actually down in section 3, 236. What's happened is that they are now close to breaking into the temple. The final battle is about to take place. And there's already been horrendous destruction. There's been fires. There's been all kinds of things. So now the question is, what's going to happen next? All right, so we're actually Book 6, Chapter 4, Section 3, line 236. Robert, do you want to pick it up there? But then on the next day...
Then on the next day, Titus commanded part of his army to quench the fire and to make a road for the more easy marching up of the legions, while he himself gathered the commanders together. Of those there were assembled the 6 principal persons.
So, this is the evening. This is in the evening. He gets together his general staff, and he's going to tell you who was there. And Josephus undoubtedly was there, was probably there. All right, read.
Tiberius Alexander, the commander under the general of the whole army.
The chief of staff, our good friend and real traitor, the nephew of Philo of Alexandria, Tiberius Julius Alexander. Go on.
With Sextus Aurelius, the commander of the 5th Legion, and Larsius Leptus, the commander of the 10th Legion, and Titus Flavius, the commander of the 15th Legion.
Okay, so these are the 3 principal legions. These are the legates of the 3 principal legions at the siege. Therefore, they are the 3 most important commanders after Tiberius Alexander under Titus. Go on.
There were also with them Eternius, the leader of the 2 legions that came from Alexandria, and Marcus Antonius Julianus, procurator of Judea. After these came together all the rest of the procurators and tribunes.
So this general staff and all the senior officers in a council of war the night before they're going to break into the temple. Go on.
Titus proposed to those that they should give him their advice what should be done about the holy house. Now, some of these thought it would be best way to act according to the rules of war and demolish it. Well, that's added by someone. Because the Jews would never leave off rebelling while that house was standing, at which house it was that they used to get all together.
Well, the temple remained as the focus for concourse from every quarter. And, to a certain extent, that's correct. All right? Go on.
Others of them were of opinion that in case the Jews would leave it, and none of them would lay their arms up in it, it might save it. He might save it. But that in case they got upon it and fought any more, he might burn it, because it might then be looked upon not as a holy house, but as a citadel, and that the impiety of burning it would then belong to those that forced this to be done, and not to these Romans.
Right. In other words, if they are going to fight, it's no longer a holy place, and therefore it will not be sacrilege on the part of the Roman soldiers to have destroyed it, because the Romans were extremely respectful of other people's temples. Go on.
But Titus said that, although the Jews should get upon the holy house and fight us thence, yet ought we not to revenge ourselves on them that are inanimate, instead of the men themselves, and that it was not in any case for burning down so vast a work as that was, because this would be a mischief to the Romans themselves, as it would be an ornament to their government while it continued. So Fronto and Alexander and Cyrilius grew bold upon that declaration and agreed to the opinion of Titus. Then was this assembly dissolved, when Titus had given orders to the commanders that the rest of their forces should lie still, but that they should make use of such as was most courageous in the attack. So he commanded that the chosen men were taken out of their cohorts should make their way to the ruins and quench the fire.
Okay, so what is the way in which Josephus pictures this?
He is trying to say that Titus really tried very hard not to destroy the temple.
Yes, that's his view. We have another account of this council. There was a Christian writer who lived in Gallia Aquitania, which is the Roman province that is today the French area called Aquitaine. His name was Sulpicius Severus. He lived from around 363 to 425. He was Christian. And he wrote something called the Historia Sacra, the sacred history, which he goes from the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, down to his own day. In the process, he tells the story of the war. And historians believe his account, although colored by his Christianity, is based on a lost section of Tacitus's Histories, because Tacitus's Histories does not come down to us in a complete way, and there's a gap around of the siege. Okay, so
Rabbi, who's reporting this? Who is this historian?
Historians believe this, and if you go
No, what is his name?
His name is Sulpicius Severus. You will get this in the email. And so Sulpicius Severus has a more complete copy of Tacitus in front of him. Okay? And so when you go to the Loeb Classical Library edition of Tacitus, they actually include this section in the fragments of Tacitus, as a fragment of Tacitus, because they have found quotes from Tacitus from other ancient sources as well. Here it is. I'm going to read it to you. The Jew, this is chapter 30 of his sacred history, written around the year 403. Tacitus is writing after Josephus, but also has access to his own sources. The Jews, meanwhile, being closely besieged, as no chance either of peace or surrender was allowed them, were at length perishing from famine, and the streets began everywhere to fill with dead bodies, for the duty of burying them could no longer be performed. So far it's following it. All right, you want to maybe move the recorder closer to me at this point. Moreover, they ventured on eating all things of the most abominable nature, and did not even abstain from human bodies, except those whose putrefaction had already laid hold of, and thus excluded them from use as food. This kind of follows also what Josephus just told us, right? The Romans, accordingly, rushed in upon the exhausted defenders of the city. And so it happened that the whole multitude from the country and from other towns of Judea had been then assembled for the day of the Passover. This also follows what Josephus said, that one of the reasons why there were so many people in Jerusalem is they got caught there because of the Passover holiday. Doubtless because it pleased God that the impious race should be given over to the destruction at the very time of the year when they had crucified the Lord. That's his Christian little editorial comment there. The Pharisees, for a long time, maintained their ground most boldly in defense of the temple. Notice how he puts the Pharisees, who like, of course, Josephus doesn't mention all, and are not involved in the fighting. He puts the Pharisees amongst the rebels, the leaders of the rebels, because, of course, Jesus had conflict with the Pharisees, so he's throwing that in. So that's, because we know the Pharisees were part of the peace party. Maintained their ground most boldly in defense of the temple, and at length, with minds obviously bent on death, they of their own accord committed themselves to the flames, meaning they killed themselves by throwing themselves into the fire. The number of those who suffered death is related to have been 100,000 were taken captive and sold. So he's saying 11,000 killed and 100,000 into captivity. This is the point. This is the passage now. Titus, it is said, after calling a council to have first deliberated whether he should destroy the temple, a structure of such extraordinary work. For it seemed good to some that a sacred edifice distinguished above all human achievements ought not to be destroyed, inasmuch as, if preserved, it would furnish an evidence of Roman moderation, but if destroyed, would serve for a perpetual proof of Roman cruelty. But on the opposite side, others, and Titus himself, thought that the temple ought specially to be overthrown in order that the religion of the Jews and of the Christians, that's an anachronism obviously, might more thoroughly be subverted. For that these religions, although contrary to each other, had nonetheless proceeded from the same authors, that Christians had sprung up from among the Jews, and that if the root were not extirpated, the offshoot would speedily perish. Thus, according to the divine will, the minds of all being inflamed, the temple was destroyed 331 years ago. And then he adds some other stuff about, this is the punishment for the Jews' sins. So Tacitus evidently has a different account of this meeting, where Titus was the one who pushed for the destruction of the temple.
But the agenda here is also to attack Christianity.
No, his agenda is to defend Christianity. The writer is a Christian, but Tacitus would not have mentioned the Christians. Okay,
I see.
That part is completely added by this guy. But historians believe that what you have is a different account of the same council, and Josephus is depicting Titus as being this noble guy who doesn't want to destroy the temple, who actively tells the soldiers to put the fires out, whereas Tacitus, apparently, has an opposite view, that Titus is the one who said, we ought to burn this thing to the ground because it's going to be the center of rebellion.
It sounds more likely.
Yes, it does sound more likely. It absolutely does sound more likely. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. The Romans don't. Josephus blames it on the soldiers, okay? He blames it on the rebels. But the point is, he says, this is what he says: at that moment, one of the soldiers, without orders, but quote, moved by some supernatural impulse, end quote, snatches a burning timber from a fire and throws it through a golden door on the north side of the chamber surrounding the sanctuary. So it's as if it's a divine impulse. This Roman soldier sets fire to the temple. All right? And Titus is given the news. He tries to tell them to stop it, but nobody hears him or ignores it. And the building can still be saved. Titus makes a second attempt to have the fire put out, but when he leaves the building, somebody who had entered with him thrusts a firebrand through the hinges of the gate, and the whole place goes up in flames. And what Josephus does in line 271 is to give an eyewitness account of the destruction. Let's take a look at that. Line 271. This is Book 6, Chapter 5, Section 1. Paul, do you want to start reading? Let's pass the recording down closer to Paul. While the holy house was on fire.
While the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those who were caught were slain. Nor was there a commiseration of any age or reverence of gravity, but children and old men and profane persons and priests were all slain in the same manner, so that this war went round all sorts of men and brought them to destruction. And as well those that made supplications for their lives as those that defended themselves by fighting. The flame was also carried a long way and made an echo together with the groans of those that were slain. And because this hill was high, and the works at the whole city had been on fire, nor was one imagined anything either greater or more terrible than this noise. For there was at once a shout of Roman legions who were marching all together, and a sad clamor of seditious who were now surrounded by fire and sword.
Okay, you can stop there. One of the things that Josephus does in the previous paragraph is he says that the temple was destroyed on the very same day as the first temple, which we observe today as the 9th of Av.
Tisha B'Av.
Now, when you actually look at the Bible, it's actually the first temple was actually not destroyed on the 9th of Av, but the Jewish tradition conflates the two together. And that's what he says. He was undoubtedly right there when this happened. What happens is that after the temple is destroyed, that's not the end of the war. He gives an account of the fact of all the prophecies that had predicted this to happen, which include a star resembling a sword standing over the city. This is from line 315. A comet, a brilliant light around the altar, a vision of armed battalions in the sky, voices in the temple, along with the prophecies of a peasant crying, "Woe to Jerusalem." And there's also a legend that is preserved in both, I think it's both in the rabbinic literature and but it's in the New Testament, that the great parochet, the great veil in front of the Holy of Holies was torn all of a sudden, some years, miraculously ripped before at some point.
When Jesus was crucified, when Jesus died, the veil of the temple.
Oh, that's okay. There's the reference. Okay, I think actually there's a similar legend in rabbinic literature, but not when Jesus was crucified, obviously. But the point is, the Romans then do their own sacrifices in the temple, the sacrifices of victory. The rebels continue to flee into the rest of the city, including the rest of the upper city. The lower city is burned, and Josephus is still trying to get them to stop, or at least to give up what the relics they have. He mentions that they are hiding in underground tunnels, which there were underground tunnels for the priests to get off the Temple Mount.
Where is this, Rebel?
This is in line 379. Then September 7th, this is line September 7th, Titus has new earthworks built to attack the upper city, because the upper city is still holding out. So even though we celebrate the 9th of Av as the destruction of Jerusalem, in fact, it wasn't the end of the siege. That was when the temple was destroyed. So there's still a piece of the city that's still under siege. And what happens ultimately is that the upper city ultimately is captured by September 25th. But there's an interesting point that we had looked at, that in Josephus's autobiography, which of course he writes much later than this, he gets permission from Titus to release his brother and 50 friends. And he also goes into the temple compound and liberates 190 captive women and children that he knows. He recognizes some friends who had been crucified, and he manages to save one of them because he wasn't dead yet. But he doesn't say that in his account in the war. That whole incident is not in the war. So did it happen and he just didn't put it in for various reasons, or did he in effect add that to the life, which he wrote years later, to make himself look better? We don't know. The Romans now command the whole city by September 26th. They loot the city, the whole city's in flames. Everybody is either enslaved or killed. And according to Josephus, 1 million people were killed in the siege. 97,000 are held captive, and 1,100,000 are killed. Simon and John, who are the leaders, are eventually captured, and they are taken to. John is sentenced to life in prison, while Simon is executed at the Triumph in Rome. Because this was very common. When there was a great Roman victory, the general would take prisoners from and captives from there to Rome, where the general would be given a triumph, which was a formal parade, which all the plunder was paraded, the legions would parade, the prisoners and slaves, and those leaders of the rebellion or whoever they were fighting against were displayed and then publicly executed. And what happens is they set fire to the wall. The walls are razed. Everything is demolished. And what happens is that when this is done, they only leave a few of the towers and a part of the wall on the west, which is the western wall today.
Where is this, Rabbi?
This is this is in chapter of book 7. This is the beginning of book 7. The 10th legion Fretensis is left to become the garrison of Jerusalem. And what's interesting is that there have been various inscriptions that have been found throughout the land of Israel testifying to the occupation of the 10th Legion Fretensis, including this, which is was found in Jerusalem itself. The inscription says, in effect, mentions the legate of the who it was, the legate of the leader of it. It says 10 Fretensis, and then it talks about the fact that it was there. And the 10th Fretensis is actually a very interesting legion. It was founded by Augustus in the 40s BC, and records of it exist until around the beginning of the 5th century. So for 450 years, this legion existed, and for a chunk of that, it was in Judea. In other words, it was one of the original legions that Vespasian brought to Judea. It was involved with the reduction of the Galilee at the siege of Gamla. It was one of the legions, the principal legions at the siege of Jerusalem. It was garrisoned in Jerusalem, and it was then used for, as we will look at next week briefly, the siege of Masada. It was the legion at the siege of Masada. And it went back to Jerusalem after the reduction of Masada, where it was occupying Jerusalem for decades until the outbreak of the Bar Kokhba War. It was the legion in Judea when the Bar Kokhba War broke out. It survived that and continued to act in the eastern part of the empire until the 2nd century, when I think it was moved somewhere else. The point is that it's fascinating that they have found inscriptions of the 10th Fretensis, not only from the period of the First War, but from the Bar Kokhba revolt as well, from some of the ruins of certain cities that were destroyed during the Bar Kokhba War. Now, what happens, of course, is that Titus gets to have a triumph, and a triumphal arch is built in his honor, which you can see in Rome today. I actually got to go there 2 years ago and spit on it, which is what you're supposed to do. I looked around and very quickly, as a Jew, the first time I was ever in Rome as a teenager, there was a strike by the museum guard, so I couldn't get into the forum to spit on the Arch of Titus. I finally got my wish to do so. What's interesting is, of course, that on the Arch of Titus, you have a frieze showing the Romans carrying off the temple treasury, including the one of the great menorahs.
So, Was it hidden and they found it afterward? I mean, how did it survive all this fire and war?
They grabbed it. It was in one of the outer courts, probably, something. And they grabbed it along with a whole bunch of other stuff. When it was gold, they didn't hesitate. This is the inscription on the top of it. It says in Latin, Senatus Populusque Romanus Divito Titus Divi Vespaniao Filio Vespaniao Augusto. The Roman Senate and people dedicate this to the divine Titus Vespasianus Augustus, son of the divine Vespasian. And we know that the temple treasury was enormous and was captured by the Romans and was used by Vespasian to build the Colosseum. In addition, there were a couple of there was another place which got the nickname the Temple of Peace, of which there are some pieces. There's pieces left in near the Forum, which was also built by Vespasian in honor of the victory in the war. And the Romans issued commemorative coins as well, which I'll put on the slideshow, showing Judea as a woman mourning and a Roman, and I think it was Vespasian or Titus lording it over her.
Judea Capta.
Judea Capta. And of course, we know that when the Bar Kokhba revolt, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jerusalem the name is changed, the city is changed, temple to Jupiter is put on the Temple Mount, and Judea's name is changed to Palestine. That's when the Romans did it. They wanted to, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, if the first war wasn't bad enough, the second war was worse, and they wanted to obliterate even the name of Judea. So what happens is that after Titus goes to Alexandria, interestingly enough, the 12th Legion, which had been defeated by the Jews under Cestius, is banished to the Armenian border. The 5th and the 15th Legion accompany Titus to Caesarea and then to Alexandria, and then eventually he goes to Rome. So that's the end of the siege. That's not the end of the war. 3 fortresses hold out for another 4 years, one of which is Masada. So next week we will briefly look at talk about the final acts of the war, and we will move into looking at Josephus as a Bible commentator, which will occupy us for the last 3 sessions of the class. Any final comments or questions at this point? Anybody have? Okay, we can pass up the recording. I will turn it off, and I'm going to try and get last week's class recording of the class up on YouTube sometime today or early tomorrow.
The saddest lecture we have ever had from you, Rabbi Schuster, was today.